Hey, great. Welcome everybody to LGBT in Sci-Fi Fantasy. This is really exciting for us. I think this is actually our first LGBTQ panel that we've had at Ltue. So, awesome. So we are making progress. That's wonderful. I'm going to ask that we keep track of your questions and hold off. There will be time near the end to ask and answer any questions. And then I just want to start by taking a minute to have our panelists introduce themselves. And so I would like to ask if you'd like to share your pronouns or identity, how you identify yourself. And I will start by saying, Michael Jensen, I am an intersex male. I am he, him, his, but if you call me she, her, hers, I'm not going to be offended. So, not a problem. And I'm really excited to do this panel. We've got some pretty incredible people here. So let's start with J. Scott Bronson. So you, from what I understand, you are an actor and award-winning playwright. You were in Touched by an Angel, is that correct?
True. All true.
Okay, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your pronouns or how you identify yourself?
It's the first time I've been asked that in my life. And I've always just identified myself by my name. And I'm a he. I grew up in San Diego, born and raised there. I'm pretty old, and I moved to Utah at a fairly young age, and got married, got kids, and got stuck. I'm on the panel today, I think, because I have a gay son, and in the questionnaire, when we were, said, you're going to be a presenter. Pick all the things that interest you. I clicked the box that said LGBTQ because I'm interested in those issues. And so I got a little thing, said, these are the panels we've put you on, and this was one of them. And I was like, awesome, excellent, I'll show up. And that's all I can think of. Yes, I'm a playwright and a novelist and an actor. Done a lot more stage lately than television or film.
Well, thank you. We are happy to have you. Jeb. So I understand you're an author of science fiction. You've worked in supercomputer and AI programming. Sounds really impressive. So,
it's all grunge when you get right down to it. But yeah, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and I grew up not far from the jail in Liberty where Joseph was incarcerated. So I remember seeing those when I was young, not understanding anything about it.
You need to speak up.
Oh, so I just wrote a book about Mormon heritage and doctrine, and that's all very interesting. I was able to use my slight knowledge of Joseph Smith in that. But as far as the focus of the panel here, my science fiction stories, the Substrate Wars, had a couple of gay characters, not too many, because you don't need too many gay characters to make a point about representing them. So I tried to pick some unusual types. For example, there's an older professor who's been to the AIDS crisis and lost his partner. That's something you don't see too often in science fiction. It's a present day story, essentially, so it's easy to do that. And I have one trans character who is basically not a stereotypical trans character. And I thought it was important that she stand up for herself and just be the person that she is. And I think writing those characters, make it the character's story, not their identity. The identity is just a part of their whole identity. So I'm introducing myself, yes. So I'm 61 years old. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about any of this. And then you started to see little hints and discussions of it in novels. There'd be characters who were clearly gay and you didn't talk about it. And then in the 60s, the late 60s particularly, science fiction writers started pioneering having really gay characters or entirely gay societies, and using that because we were more and more sociology and history in science fiction than we were just ray guns and rockets, and starting to open the whole universe to all of the possibilities that we might want to write about. And that's still going on today. So that's pretty much my story. My personal pronouns are he and its or something like that. But it never occurred to me to worry about my pronoun. I've always identified as male and not had an issue with that. So around the house, I do all the hard plumbing work and things to me. I don't have an issue with my gender identity. All right.
All right, well, thank you, and we are happy to have you as well. So let's go on to Scott, who is a winner in the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future contest.
As is the other Scott.
As is the other Scott. It's amazing.
So, talking about communities that sometimes get interesting attention, anything associated with L. Ron Hubbard is a lot of fun. I don't go there, I don't do that, but do you? I don't care, not my right. Let's see. Yeah, this is interesting for me, and especially here. I guess I'm cishet. Go by he. Hey, you ugly dummy, whatever. My daughter is Ace, and I have a lot of friends in the communities. I like quilt bag. That's just my preference because we get a little bit more expansive and inclusive that way. And I've spent a lot of time writing stories about, as I was thinking back on it, my Writers of the Future winner was a completely non-gendered character, genetically non-gendered. I've written from a gay perspective, I've written from lesbian perspective, I haven't written trans yet. I tend to take the approach because, I'm not an activist type writer, but I admire that kind of writing and the people who have that kind of bravery and are willing to come out and do that sort of thing. And basically I think, I'm one of the same people who says that, as soon as we can stop having the strong female character, right, what we ought to be doing is telling stories about characters, about people who are who they are. And if it's relevant to the story, okay, we'll talk about it. If it's not relevant to the story, we can choose or not to, as we desire individually as storytellers. And everybody, we observe alien perspectives, we observe extraterrestrial perspectives, we observe genetically modified perspectives. My heavens, of all the communities in the world, you would think that the greater science fiction and fantasy community should be the most open to any story of any type from anyone for any reason. Sorry, that was a little preachy.
That is exactly why we're here. So, all right. Well, we are very happy to have you. This is a cool panel of very just accomplished people, and I'm very happy to have everyone here. So, I'm going to start out by asking how has the portrayal of the LGBT character changed over the years? So you mentioned we didn't even talk about that. For quite some time, and so how is the perspective of the change been for this panel?
Well, it started out being easier to get published if you didn't address the issue correctly. You could sneak around by having alien societies that featured all sorts of unusual things, and that's how it started. Having human characters say the captain of your enterprise being a gay person is just something that's happened now. That wouldn't have been accepted commercially until recently.
How recent do we think that was that it kind of started to take a turn in the publishing world?
Well, in publishing in the 60s, late 60s, you started to see a lot of out-and-out gayness.
Yeah, you started to see overt characters, right?
Overt
because
characters.
Before then, we had a lot of coding going on.
Right.
And there were characters who had perspectives. And I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to offer a lot of authors or titles at this point. But it is interesting, as you point out, right? We get into the mid-60s, late 60s, and early 70s, when Isaac Asimov comes out and writes a novel about a trigendered society, he didn't feel like he could take it on directly, no pun intended, take it on straight. He had to he had to create, again, an alien thing, but what he did do was honestly and with scientific, right, with his traditional logical approach, look at the question, the idea of roles as separated from biology, the idea of labeling, tagging, and trying to make pretense that cultural assumption is the same thing as biological imperative. And you know, by the time Asimov got around, I think it was 78, you know, we already had a fairly good turn. We were starting to see a lot of literature that was starting to reflect. Of course, Left Hand of Darkness was fairly transformative because it was a, did that win the Nebula Award?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right, and so essentially it was the first accepted science fictional alternate, whatever that means, viewpoint of what human sexuality, identity, and gender means. So yeah, we've had coding, like most of literature has, for a long time, I think. But I think mid-60s, the first experimental ones, some of the more, again.
I did some research to remind myself that back in the late 50s, you had exotic writers like Philip Lizzie Farmer and Theodore Sturgeon who addressed these issues in basically niche stories and novels. So they were pioneers in that kind of thing. Then Joanna Russ, with The Female Man, started to work the female side of this same story. And she made sort of bitter comments about being blocked from further work after she started doing this kind of thing. Thomas Dish, same thing.
What's funny is that many years later, a fair number of those authors came out.
Yeah.
Isaac Asimov did come out at the end. It's interesting.
What?
Yeah.
Come out as what?
Gay.
Oh, no, that's not true.
Is that not true?
Sorry, that's not
I thought I understood that he had.
He died of AIDS, but he wasn't gay as far as we know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me correct me if I got these wrong.
You may have
Because I've
made
got
that-
some misconceptions in my vocabulary here.
No, he was known for hitting on women a lot. So.
Well, yeah, okay. Bi, omni, whatever. Which is the problem with people like Harvey Weinstein.
And a lot of the early discussion of sexuality just blew it all open, so you couldn't write about straight sex very much. And when you started seeing novels that are basically about sex, like some of Philip J. Farmer's things, he would include gay sex as part of this whole panoply of things that are possible. So.
It could be done. And then you started to bring it into the mainstream with authors like, again, Asimov brought it in, what's his name?
And there's the hidden history of like Robert Silverberg, who made enough money writing pornography to buy a mansion in New York where he still lives.
Same thing. Why did I say bad names today? Mike Resnick, who made a living writing porn.
Yeah, there were a bunch of them.
He'd write one a week to make about
Cranking
$5,000
them
a
out,
week, cranking him out,
yes.
and that paid for his kennel and his science fiction career. So, you know, interesting stuff. But yeah, there was a lot of that going on. Damon Knight was a behind the scenes, activist for understanding and acceptance. But he tended to do that more in the form of essay than his fiction, because his fiction tended to be, of course, terrible with names today, I'll shut up.
Okay, well, very good. So I want to ask the impressions that we've had in our own lives. So when do you think you first saw a character that was out and open that made a huge impression for you? For me, it was Ellen when she came out on her puppy episode. It was a big deal because I hadn't seen anything on mainstream television, anything like that. And I think that's when I had first started to ask those questions within myself too, and trying to figure out how I identified. So that was a big one for me. I'm wondering what other people's first impressions of a character coming out or being different than the mainstream straight.
The one that I remember in science fiction the most is the characters Joseph and Onset in Songmaster. It just kind of was a left turn in the story that You know, I hadn't seen anything like that in a story, and I was. It's one of those things where, and this has happened to me a few times in the book, and not just for the same, for, you know, a gender or sexuality issue or anything like that, but just sometimes the story takes a turn and I go, wait a minute. And I had to go back and say, did I just read that right? I read one where a guy got killed, the main character got killed a third of the way into the book. And I was walking when I was reading the book, and I turned around and I walked back to where I had read that. And read it again, walking to see if maybe I'd walked through some portal and maybe it would change. Literally, I did that. And this happened with Songmaster. And I thought, wow. Didn't see that coming, but that doesn't mean it's wrong for the story. So I went back and here's the thing about a Scott Card book. He can take you by surprise with something like that, but if you go back and start over, you go, you laid the groundwork like mad. You know, just the foreshadowing was all over the place. And so that's why it worked in the story for me, and I was like, and you know, these guys were still the heroes of the story. I thought that was a bold and brave move to make, and I liked it. So that was the, you know, I grew up on, you know, Robert Heinlein and Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so when whatever anybody's feelings about Scott Card are now, when I started reading him, I was like, he's writing about human beings, right? Which was something that I hadn't read much in science fiction up to that point, something that I hadn't read much. You know, my wife asked me, you know, she grew up in his neighborhood. They were friends. And when I was here, I was reading his books, and she says, are they good? And I said, yeah. She says, what makes them so good, better than whatever? And I said, because they're about human beings. It's character first, and then the science or whatever, right? And I think that's truly the issue when we're talking about this issue. Human beings first.
And to a certain degree, I feel like a major imposter because I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. But you talk about experiences. Of course, the first novel that really kind of went directly at it for me was Left Hand of Darkness. I read that when I was about 15 years old. And it was the perfect framework for me as an individual person to think about the questions of identity, role, behavior, et cetera, and the intersection of biology with identity. As far as real life experiences, I actually have a friend who's gay, and I went to, sadly, his partner died from AIDS, from HIV, and I went to the funeral, and it was really interesting for me because as a person, I was frankly a little closed and bigoted at that point. I had assumptions. I'd grown up in the 70s when we used fag as a generic epithet. And I cannot apologize enough for that. But it was a Mormon funeral, and when I closed my eyes and listened to the words and didn't bring a cultural preconception with me, what I heard was a testament of an admirable relationship, of a loving relationship between two men. And literally in that moment, my gay friend opened my eyes while my eyes were closed and helped me understand that my silly preconceptions and narrowed views and notions were exactly that. They were superstition, they were prejudice. And that love, that identity is up to you. So for me, that was really transformative. And it was literally at that point back in the late 80s or early 90s where I started realizing, okay, and I actively started putting characters into stories that were not, normative, typical characters. So,
All right. Yeah. So I was 10 years old when I realized that I was kind of different. So I was reading science fiction heavily, then taking 10 books a week home from the library, reading all of them. Looking for every sign by that point, and being thrilled to see a character who is obviously gay, even though they might not go into it. Yeah, that when they talk about representation and how children need to see at least some examples of what they are, and I think that's perfectly reasonable up to a point. It's possible we may have gone too far in pushing for representation at this point, but you know, it's an overshoot that will correct itself as we concentrate on the characters themselves. I think the first book that I can remember where gay characters were prominent, and that was not dooming them in any way, was Ethan of Athos by Louis Blugeot, where the entire society on this planet is male, and they use artificial means to reproduce themselves. And from the point of view of a character who goes outside that society and then deals with how people talk to him, it was very useful for me to see that. And past that, you see lots and lots of characters, but that was the one that made an impression on me.
Very cool.
1978.
When I was born.
Oh, there's also a really good book by, if you like S&M, there's a really good book by George Nader, the former film star, who was a friend of Ron Benson's. For some reason, decided he would write a science fiction book set on a planet basically all male with S&M and dominance and submission being the primary themes. That's a fascinating read, and you can still get it used. So if you want to look at something from the very earliest days, that was also 78.
and that's an entirely different conversation.
Yeah.
To discuss the S&M and the dominance.
It's not included in our panel's topic today.
After the panel, after Joe talks. But,
Yeah, so that conversation is in the 50 Shades of Grey panel down the hall.
But you have to be a billionaire for that to work.
yeah, that was not
So
available to
we have a lot of writers here, and I'm very curious as to, do you feel it's important for us to be writing gay, queer, trans characters? Is that an important thing for society, or is that something that you mentioned maybe we're doing too much of that, maybe we need to tone it down? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we need to make it realistic. So, you know, make the characters as characters actually are. This is one component of their identity. It's not all their story. Every plot element is not about the fact that I'm gay and I'm oppressed, or I'm a trans person who's being injured and suffered my entire life, so I have PTSD. We have maybe too many characters who have PTSD by now.
Well, you know, and that's the hard thing about it, right? Because any social movement, any recognition movement,
Right.
has to go through those stages, right?
Right.
Feminism went through it. Civil rights have gone through it. That we first say, look, the mainstream will include characters, but they're always types and generally the butt of the joke. Then we start having the character who is, right, like the strong female,
Yeah.
or the gay,
We will
the
overdo this
empowered
for a
gay
while
man,
until you're sick of it,
or
yes.
you know, and because we have to do symbolic and we have to represent it because we want to bring that out. But the point you made earlier, I think, is really important. When you're reading and you don't see people who look like you, who think like you, who behave, who are attracted as you are, it is quietly, and I always hate to use the revolutionary words, but it is quietly oppressive. You do not find acceptance. So as an author, I believe it's incredibly important that we have a diversity in our literature, that we tell the stories of activism, that we tell the stories of PTSD, because you know what? Especially right now as we're transitioning to acceptance, there are a lot of people who lived very long lives in trauma.
Or headed well.
Yes, hurrah for that. I'm going to use my son as an example. When I said that they have to be human characters, like Scott was saying, and we're all saying basically, is can't just be this one thing that how we identify them. My son was ostracized by his community his whole life. And he didn't come out till he was 16, 17. But there were other things. He was half deaf. That made it difficult for him to fit into society. There's an anxiety disorder. That makes it difficult for him to fit in, with folks. He's probably, even though he's never been diagnosed, he's probably somewhere on the autism spectrum. Based on a lifetime of watching his behavior, I would assume, and he's pretty high on it. That makes things difficult for him. And then he's gay, right? And sometimes he's kind of an asshole, right?
As people often are.
Often are. Most of the time, he's really sweet, charming, and lovely, okay? But if I say, well, I'm not gay, so if I put a gay character in my story, I can't make him an asshole ever. Because then they'll think I think that's what they are. If I treat him like a human being, I can make him a whole human being. Then I think, I've written Mormons who are assholes, right? And I can get away with that because I'm Mormon.
Because you are one, right?
Right?
An asshole. Hey, we've been friends for 30 years.
And so that's what I want to do, And I want to represent all the people in my life. I've been in theater since junior high school. I've got a lot of gay friends. And different styles of gay, right? Hey, I've got those friends. And then I've got the friends who are just, well, I'm gay, so what? I play football, so what? Oh, I would have never pegged again, so what? Kind of a thing, right? There's a spectrum there too. And I want to cover all of that so that when you get into my story, it's like someone in there is recognizable to you. Maybe all of them, right? Can I tell a little story about language?
Yeah, please.
I've written from perspective of women, young girls, boys, men, right? It's a dicey thing to do because I'm not a woman or a young girl. And I found out this past year that I cannot write from the point of view, I'm not allowed, because of sensitivities in the publishing thing. I had a Native American character in a story. I cannot represent them in certain ways no matter what because I am not Native American. But at the same time, there are aspects of language that we share. I went to one of my dearest friends in the world is part Native American. His father died last year. And I went to his funeral, and he and his son and 3 of his daughters sang at the funeral Amazing Grace in their native language. It was amazing. I've never felt, without understanding exactly the words, I've never felt about that song the way I felt that day. Because, and I went and talked to John's oldest daughter after this, because she's the one that's really kind of, in his family, the one who's most kind of reviving. She's learning the language and reviving the culture in her life. And I said, listen, I don't know if this is true or not, but you tell me. It seems to me like I could use the words of your language, but I couldn't really speak the language unless I could actually feel the words of that language, because there were words that you sang in that song that I thought would not be properly interpreted without the emotion behind them. Right? I can say gay, but I can't feel that, because I'm not. Right? So I have to be very careful about the way I use that, not being it. So I use the human language and hope that that brings the culture and whatever other parts of that together close enough so that I'm not offensive. But I think language is not just a thing made of words.
And I think there's something deeply powerful there, that part of what happens is you have this common experience through a shared medium that was not about, yes, it was native culture because it was sung in the native language, but it was your culture and the native culture blended in a way that spoke to all hearts at the same time.
I felt it from them, but I couldn't have sung it the way they sung it.
No, you can't, and that is true. And that becomes, I think that's an interesting question now, because if you don't have the perspective, ought you to write the stories? If you don't have the experience. Now, as a science fiction person, I can be very blasé and say, I tell stories about all kinds of people from all kinds of positions. I always attempt to be respectful and to try as much as I can to understand from within. When I finally gave myself permission to empathize rather than fear, all of a sudden, just a whole bunch of things suddenly became really obvious and clear. And it was like, oh, I think there are fewer, because we're all a little brittle these days, right? Because we don't have acceptance yet, but we are in transition. And that's part of the challenge, is always a difficult, that last mile is always the hardest.
Right, so you're a writer, and you're going to write about characters who are not you and had experiences that you've never had. And of course, there's a certain sensitivity there. If people feel they've been wronged by stereotypes or misrepresentations in the past, they're going to leap on you for anything that you do wrong. So today we have the phenomenon of the Twitter mob, which will come after you. In why this has happened a lot recently, there's been a lot of stories about it. Perfectly respected author goes to a native tribe, consults with them, writes their story, gives them credit, and then they're attacked by another faction of the same tribe because we can't have you doing something.
But that conversation is useful.
Right.
Is it productive always? No.
Not for the person who's writing,
But it's a useful conversation to have if we can avoid the condemnation, and that's
Right.
part of the point.
So it's really important to empathize and be sensitive to their story, and you have to feel free to write the character as the character is.
Right, because
Maybe you'll be attacked, I don't know, but you should be able to do that. And I think it's becoming more obvious that some of the outrage mobs are overdoing it, and you are a little safer than you were last year, say.
well, and it is, and that's part of the nice thing about living right now is that it's coming to the point now where you can come back and say, hey, no,
You're overdoing it too much, yeah.
Well, and it
I don't
is,
have to take it anymore. I can respond now.
All of that was to say, I as a writer feel like I can have characters, whatever, LGBTQ, Native American, whatever, in my story that I empathize with, but I cannot tell that story,
That's perspective.
their story.
From inside their
You've
head.
got to have people inside
That's right.
that culture, that feeling, that language.
But clearly, you're
telling
going to be
their
writing a story with many characters, and you can't be representing all of them
Right.
inside yourself.
Not
Right.
every story can have every character type, not every author can deal with every character type, right? That's why you have a diverse community of different voices doing what they do,
So do your best.
right? And do your best with whatever you got. And if you need to tell stories of activism, fine, tell stories of activism. Understand that short term, you're going to have some struggle, you're going to have some headwind, but there are a lot of us who, whether we're in the community, support the community. And we want to see everyone succeed on their own basis, telling their true stories.
And how
so
do you do it?
what if you don't know the culture? What if you don't know, but you know that's the character you want to write? What are some suggestions?
There's
that we have?
research. You do lots of research.
Ah, okay.
Read about that type of person. You see what they have to say about themselves. You do your best to empathize.
Moment. So yeah, research is important. So I had the opportunity to sit down with a couple of my trans friends because I'm writing a trans character, and that was very fascinating, very interesting, and I'm so glad I did that because I got to know them on a whole different level. Got to be very, and they were happy to share that information. Like, everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to let you know the struggles they've gone through. And so I guess that's my piece of advice here is don't be afraid to meet people if you're writing a character about a gay person or a trans
Right.
person, meet them, talk to them.
I want to write about you. Tell me stuff.
Yeah, right?
Well, that's the funny thing about it, right? I read a story about a cop. I'm not a cop. I don't know what it means to be a cop, but I can go talk to a bunch of cops and get some perspective. If I talk to enough people, I can start to get a complex enough mosaic that I can start to understand something of that perspective. And if I can do that, and again, if I'm being honest and not trying to manipulate my reader, then we win, right?
Well, and I have an anecdote about that. So I did put a trans character into my Substrate Wars series. And then I went to Tao's Toolbox, and I was talking to Sunil Patel, who's a typical activist in the diversity community. And he's saying, oh, no, you really have to do more research than you've done. He hadn't read about the character very much. But it turns out that I have known many trans people. One of our friends is a consulting psychologist, assists people going through the surgeries, and has been for 20 or 30 years. So I've seen many of their stories and talked to many of them before. I didn't really have to do research beyond that because I understand how they feel. And I've seen how they're attacked and how they seek protection because it's good to be with someone who you know is safe, so someone can't hassle you. Being alone is bad on the subway, for example. When you're, shall we say, an obvious male who's passing as a female, it becomes a big issue because people will attack you just for that. So yeah, I was happy that he asked me about that. But
They won't attack me.
well, there's a certain belief that a writer writing about a character doesn't understand them if it isn't exactly what the person reading wants.
But that's an interesting perspective, right? Because you talk about that. And I'm using all kinds of people, but I've got a friend who's very, very short. And the number of times he and I went to lunch like every work day for 5 years. And I cannot tell you the number of times when you go into a restaurant and they would just look right past him at me because I was a foot taller than him and I'm reasonably large and he's not. And it started to occur to me, hey, wait a minute, that's an experience that I do not have and that I cannot know because I have always had the benefit of that privilege.
Okay. I'm going to cut us off here because I really want to hear from the audience any questions that we might
Good
have.
thoughts.
Yeah, two quick things for resource writing. The other by Nisi Shawl, and I think it's Ward, I believe. The writers on that, Nisi Shawl, who's a science fiction writer, African-American woman. Also, when you're talking about the sensitivities of things, sometimes you have to choose between two possibly problematic types to do, because I had a story of a werebear fighting activist story. And here he is defending a community of people of color. I choose between a white savior and the problematic trope of an animalistic black man.
Right.
And so I finally decided white savior was more problematic if I fully formed the werebear character as a gay black man better, and fully form him out as a person rather than having a white were person save his community as a white savior trope. Which I think is in some ways a lot worse because that disempowers that community by doing that.
Right.
So,
Which is the great thing about writing more than one story.
Yeah.
oh yeah, of course.
This is something that you guys have touched on throughout the panel, but the question I have is, as like a cisgender straight woman who wants to write these characters, what's the line between feeling like it's not my story to write necessarily, but also just wanting to represent reality as well?
Yeah.
Like, where do you find? I mean, it comes down to empathy, but where's that line? How do you approach that?
Can I try to rephrase that question and see if it
Please.
still fits? Am I better off to do it badly than not to do it at all?
Yes.
Or to risk doing it badly? Whether I do it badly or not, to risk doing it badly than not to do it all. I don't know, what do you guys think?
And ideally, you have a beta reader or 2 or 3 who can flag anything.
I think taking the shot is important, yeah.
But yeah, giving it a try should be appreciated.
I think telling the human story and then getting people, to say, I would have said it this way, or I would have blah, 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 right? But
So I published a novel of Scott's that dealt with female perspective. And he had taken it to some writing groups of women and got a fairly aggressive split as to whether it was accurate and reasonable. Because guess what? We're all on a spectrum, right? All of us. So I think, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's the,
I think kind of it's important that, you know, if you're coming from a good place, right? If you're going out there to write a screed and to condemn somebody for something, go home. I don't want to hear about you. But you know what? It's your right. Write the story, put it out there, and if you can sell it, good luck.
I'll tell you another story I don't like. If you borrow just a trope or two from my perspective, okay? I know there's a lot of people who love Angels in America, okay? I read both plays. Nobody talks about Perestroika, but I read both plays, and I read an interview with Tony Kushner, and he says, yeah, I was in Utah at the Sundance Institute working on it, and I thought, hey, these Mormons have some interesting things about them. I think I'll put a couple of those in my play. Well, you know what? It's not Mormon.
It's not quite right.
From my point of view. Yeah, use the angel, use the this, use the that. It doesn't feel real to me, right? And I think you're cheating when you do that. Get the human thing, all right?
Early
And
example
then
of
do
cultural
more
appropriation.
research.
I think, yeah, I think it's important more than anything to look at a person as gay or trans because they're a lot more than just that. They're people, and they just happen to be gay or trans. So when you're writing a character, write the character as an interesting person, and then add the little additional parts of, well, and they happen to be trans or they happen to be gay. And I think that helps a lot. Oh, there's several questions, so go ahead.
Scott, as a gay Jew, I give you permission to write gay Jew. But
Gay white Jews.
to the woman over there, two books which had an effect on me. One was the Last Herald Maid series by Mercedes Lackey, who I believe is a straight woman. I don't know anything about her. And it's a great series, The Gay Mage. And it's wonderful. It's a gay man. I said, yes. And then Sarah Hoyt asked me to read her book, a science fiction book, A Few Good Men, with a gay protagonist. And I said, you don't need to change a thing. For whatever reason, Sarah got it right. And I think we want more straight women writing gay men, because there are a lot of gay men who write straight women. And I don't know if it's a question, but it's just that I got sort of incensed because I don't think, Scott, you should be prevented from writing gay characters. And I think that we expand our horizons by trying to get in their shoes and trying to see that they're human. So I guess that's just a soapbox comment.
Thanks.
So back there.
Sure. So I'm just curious what the panel's organic or thoughts are on sort of the Dumbledore character, right? Who's never outed over the course of the books, but in the back of the opposite mind is gay. And you know, I have a self-published novel out as first in a series, and having written it, I can look back and I'm like, I think this one character is gay. I don't think, like, I mean, I obviously didn't put it in the book yet. And I'm looking at it and I think, so now what do I do with this, right? Do I just sort of leave it as interesting backstory? Because there's tons of interesting backstory that never comes out. No pun intended. Or do I, go ahead and try to develop that a little more?
I think let it be. I mean, let him be what he is. And I think it makes him more interesting to me if I have that color with it. Okay? The more color you can give something, the more shades, whatever, hues, however you want to talk about it, the more I like these people, the more I identify with them. I think, you try to, I'm going to appeal to a general audience, so I'm going to make a general sort of character. That's crap. I think you appeal to a general audience by being very specific about characters, right?
And especially in these genres, right? We want that deep perspective.
And so the more specificity, I can write it, but I can't say it. The more specific you can be, the better. And the like I say, it's just more color.
Okay, we have time for one more question right here.
So I'm pansexual, gender fluid, and all my words just exploded out of my ears. Sorry. Mostly, I'm curious as to how to deal with the fact that there seems to be this very troubling, at least for me, trend to erase the line between bisexual and pansexual. And for some people, there isn't a line. That's fine. But the way I've always seen it as, or the way I've seen the online community shifting. I mean, I live in Preston, Idaho. There's not a huge gay community there. And so most of my interaction comes from online. And I've seen a very troubling shift toward, there's already a lot of hate from both sides for the bi community. And now there's even more hate because, oh, you're bi, therefore you're transphobic. And I'm like, that's like saying a gay character is sexist because he doesn't want to have sex with a woman.
Well, I think we're at a pivotal point where we're kind of still having the conversations. And that's the great thing, is that you can be part of that conversation. Write the book how you think your character needs to be part of the conversation. If you don't know, throw it out there as a possible, could go one way or the other. But that I think is the main point here is...
Yeah, just tell the story, right? If you think a viewpoint is not represented, you think you can represent that viewpoint in a compelling story, please do it. Because that's the only way we can have the conversation. If someone stands up and says, hey, wait a minute, have you thought about this? Have you viewed it from this angle? You might be making a preconception. It's just not fair to make. Yes, some. No for others, right? And the only way to do that is by telling the story.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out.
One quick comment. So,
Two quick comments.
yeah, one quick comment for anybody. We're having lunch here in the hotel at 2 o'clock.
So that the